The gold of the setting sun glinted off the iron shackles binding Eleanor Murphy's wrists to the weather-beaten wooden post in the center of Copper Ridge's dusty Main Street. Her once pristine blue dress was soiled with dirt, her auburn hair falling loose from its pins as townsfolk passed by with averted eyes, none brave enough to defy William Blackwood, the richest man in the Arizona Territory. Eleanor's throat burned with thirst, but her resolve remained unbroken as the afternoon heat beat down upon her exposed neck. 3 hours she had been there, punishment for her public rejection of Blackwood's marriage proposal at Sunday service that morning. "Let her stand there until she learns proper gratitude," he had announced to the congregation, his voice dripping with wounded pride as his hired men dragged her away. The year was 1878, and in the newly established town of Copper Ridge, William Blackwood's word was as good as law. The silver mine he owned employed half the men in town, and his money had built the church, the schoolhouse, and the saloon. Even the sheriff owed his position to Blackwood's generous campaign contributions. "Water," Eleanor croaked as Mrs. Higgins hurried past with her young daughter in tow. The older woman quickened her pace, pulling the curious child along. No one would help her. No one dared. The clip-clop of approaching hooves made Eleanor lift her weary head. A trail-worn stranger rode into town atop a handsome buckskin stallion, dust clinging to his denim and leather. His face was partially obscured by a weathered Stetson, but she could see he was young, perhaps 30, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jawline. The rider slowed as he approached the peculiar sight of a young woman chained to a post in the center of what appeared to be a respectable frontier town, his brows furrowed beneath the brim of his hat as he pulled his horse to a stop. "What in God's name is going on here?" His voice was deep, carrying the subtle drawl of Texas. "Please," Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Water." Without hesitation, the stranger dismounted, retrieving his canteen and approaching her. He tilted it to her parched lips, allowing her to drink deeply. Eleanor swallowed greedily, water dribbling down her chin onto her bodice. "Thank you," she breathed when she'd had her fill. "Who did this to you?" The stranger's green eyes flashed with anger as he examined the chains. "William Blackwood," she replied, trying to stand straighter despite her exhaustion. "I refused his proposal of marriage." The stranger's jaw tightened. "And the law allows this." "He is the law in Copper Ridge," Eleanor replied bitterly. The stranger stepped back, surveying the town with a critical eye before returning his gaze to her. "What's your name, Miss?" "Eleanor Murphy. My father owned the general store before he passed last winter." "Elias Kane," he offered in return, tipping his hat slightly. "Recently of the Texas Rangers." A commotion from the direction of the saloon interrupted their introduction. William Blackwood emerged, flanked by his foreman and 2 other rough-looking men. At 50, Blackwood cut an imposing figure in his tailored suit, his silver-streaked black hair slicked back beneath an expensive hat. His face flushed with color when he spotted the stranger offering comfort to his prisoner. "Step away from that woman," Blackwood called, striding purposefully toward them. "She's being taught a lesson in manners." Elias didn't move, his hand casually resting on the holstered Colt at his hip. "Seems to me the only lesson being taught here is that you've got a cruel streak, mister." Blackwood's face darkened as he stopped a few paces away. "I don't believe we've met. I'm William Blackwood, owner of the Silver Strike Mine and most of this town." "Elias Kane," came the calm reply, "and I don't much care if you own the whole territory. You can't chain a woman to a post for refusing your hand." Blackwood's men spread out slightly, hands hovering near their weapons. The tension in the air thickened as townspeople began to gather at a safe distance, sensing the confrontation brewing. "This is none of your concern, stranger," Blackwood said coldly. "I suggest you mount up and be on your way. I'm making it my concern." Elias didn't raise his voice, but his words carried clearly in the tense silence. He turned to face Eleanor, his expression softening. "Miss Murphy, would you consent to marry me instead?" Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. The gathered crowd gasped. "What?" Blackwood sputtered. Elias kept his eyes on Eleanor. "I'm offering you a way out of those chains and away from this man. Say yes, and you'll be under my protection as my bride." Eleanor studied the stranger's face, searching for deceit and finding only determination and something else, compassion, perhaps. The alternative was Blackwood's continued persecution. Her decision took only seconds. "Yes," she said clearly, loud enough for all to hear. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Kane." Elias turned back to Blackwood, who stood seething with rage. "You heard the lady. She's my bride now. I'd appreciate it if you'd unlock those chains." "This is absurd," Blackwood exploded. "She can't marry a man she just met. Sheriff, do something about this." The sheriff, a portly man with a graying mustache, reluctantly stepped forward from the crowd. "Now, Mr. Blackwood, there ain't no law against a woman accepting a proposal. If she says she'll marry him, that's her right." "I own you, Jenkins," Blackwood hissed. "You employ me," the sheriff corrected with newfound courage, perhaps bolstered by the steady gaze of the former Texas Ranger. "But the law is the law. You can't hold her against her will for refusing you if she's engaged to another." Blackwood's face contorted with fury as he glared at Elias. "You have no idea who you're crossing, Kane. I've crossed worse than silver mine owners with inflated egos," Elias replied evenly. "The key, if you please." After a tense moment, Blackwood nodded to his foreman, who produced a small iron key from his vest pocket. The man approached cautiously and unlocked the shackles. Eleanor rubbed her raw wrists, tears of relief stinging her eyes. Elias removed his coat and placed it gently around her shoulders. "Can you ride, Miss Murphy?" she nodded, summoning what strength remained. "Yes." He helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her, one arm protectively around her waist. "We'll be staying at the boarding house tonight," he announced to Blackwood. "Tomorrow we'll see the preacher. Anyone who interferes will answer to me." Blackwood's face was a thundercloud. "This isn't over, Ranger, not by a long shot." "For today it is," Elias replied calmly, turning his horse toward the boarding house at the end of the street. As they rode away, Eleanor leaned back slightly against his solid chest, her mind reeling with the sudden turn of events. "Why?" she whispered. "No decent man could ride past what I saw," he answered quietly. "Don't worry, Miss Murphy, I won't hold you to this marriage once we're clear of danger." Eleanor wasn't sure if his words brought relief or disappointment. All she knew was that for the first time since her father's death, she felt safe. The boarding house was a simple two-story structure at the quieter end of town, run by a widow named Martha Williams. The older woman's eyes widened when Elias helped the disheveled Eleanor from his horse. "Good heavens, child, what happened to you?" Martha exclaimed, ushering them inside. "William Blackwood happened," Elias said grimly. "Miss Murphy needs a safe place to stay tonight." Martha's face hardened. "Say no more. That man's been throwing his weight around since he struck Silver." Come in, come in." Once inside, Martha showed them to her small parlor while she prepared hot water for washing and tea for refreshment. Eleanor sank gratefully into a worn armchair, still wrapped in Elias's coat. "I need 2 rooms for the night," Elias told Martha when she returned with the tea. "And information about the preacher." Martha set down the tray. "Rooms aren't a problem, but you should know that Reverend Phillips is in Blackwood's pocket, performs his mining company funerals, receives donations for the church." Elias frowned. "Is there another man of the cloth within riding distance?" "Circuit preacher comes through Jericho Flats, 20 miles east," Martha offered, "but he won't be back for a month." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. "Without a proper wedding, Blackwood will just claim our engagement is a ruse." "And he'd be right," Elias said quietly, meeting her gaze. "I meant what I said about not holding you to this." "Then why propose at all?" Eleanor asked. "It was the quickest way to get you free." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "I thought we'd have time to figure out a better solution." Martha looked between them, understanding dawning on her face. "You two just met today, didn't you?" They both nodded. The older woman smiled knowingly. "Well, that explains why the richest girl in town before her father's passing is suddenly engaged to a stranger." She studied them thoughtfully. "Judge Morrison in Silver Springs could make it legal. He's 3 days' ride, though." Elias nodded slowly. "That might work." "We'd need to leave at first light." "And what then?" Eleanor asked, meeting his gaze. "After we're legally married to thwart Blackwood, what happens to us?" The question hung heavy in the air between them. Elias hadn't thought that far ahead, and his expression showed it. I suppose, he said carefully, we could have it annulled once you're safely away from here. Or, he hesitated. We could give it a chance, see if companionship might grow into something more. Eleanor studied him, this stranger who had ridden into her life and changed everything in the span of an hour. He was handsome, certainly, with those green eyes and the strong line of his jaw. But more importantly, he had shown courage and decency when no one else would. I think, she said slowly, that I would like to know more about the man I'm supposedly marrying before making any decisions about our future. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That seems fair. Martha excused herself to prepare their rooms, leaving them to talk. As the evening deepened around them, Eleanor learned that Elias had indeed been a Texas Ranger for 5 years. Leaving the service after a violent confrontation with cattle rustlers left him questioning his path. He was heading west to California, where his uncle owned a horse ranch outside Sacramento. In turn, she told him about growing up in Copper Ridge, how her father had built the general store from nothing, and how Blackwood had maneuvered to acquire it after his death, leaving her nearly destitute but for the small cabin on the edge of town and whatever she could earn from sewing and laundry. Blackwood began calling shortly after the funeral, she explained. At first, I thought he was checking on my welfare, but his intentions soon became clear. When I refused his first proposal, he foreclosed on the store, claiming my father had outstanding debts. Elias's expression darkened. And no one in town stood against him. They depend on his mine for their livelihoods, Eleanor said simply. Fear is a powerful motivator. As Martha showed them to their separate rooms later that evening, Eleanor paused in the hallway. Thank you, Mr. Kane, for everything. Elias, he corrected gently, if we're to be married, even temporarily, you should use my given name. Elias, she repeated, the name feeling foreign yet somehow right on her lips. Then you must call me Eleanor. Eleanor, he said with a nod. Rest well, we have a long journey ahead. As she closed her door, Eleanor leaned against it, her mind spinning with the day's events. She had begun the morning as a desperate woman facing an impossible choice and would end it engaged to a complete stranger. Yet somehow, despite the uncertainty of her future, she felt more hopeful than she had in months. Dawn had barely broken when a sharp knock at Eleanor's door startled her awake. Martha's urgent voice came through the wood. Miss Murphy, you need to come quickly. Eleanor hastily pulled on her dress from the previous day, which Martha had kindly cleaned, and rushed downstairs to find Elias in the parlor with the sheriff. The lawman looked uncomfortable, twisting his hat in his hands. I'm sorry, Miss Murphy, Sheriff Jenkins said. Blackwood's filed kidnapping charges against Mr. Kane, says he coerced you into leaving with him. Elias stood with his arms crossed, his expression hard. It's a transparent attempt to interfere with our departure. I wasn't kidnapped, Eleanor said firmly. I accepted Mr. Kane's proposal freely. Sheriff, you were there, you saw everything. The sheriff nodded. I did, and I told Blackwood as much, but he's demanding you appear before Judge Wilson this morning to confirm it. Judge Wilson is Blackwood's cousin by marriage, Eleanor explained to Elias. Of course he is, Elias muttered. If you don't appear, the sheriff continued, I'm authorized to arrest Mr. Kane and return you to your home. Eleanor stepped closer to Elias. Then we'll appear together. The courthouse was little more than a large room attached to the jail, with wooden benches for spectators and a raised platform where Judge Wilson sat behind an imposing desk. By the time they arrived, the room was already crowded with curious townspeople. William Blackwood sat in the front row, his expression smug as Elias and Eleanor entered. His lawyer, a thin man with spectacles, shuffled papers importantly beside him. Judge Wilson, a florid-faced man with thinning hair, called the impromptu hearing to order. We're here to address charges of kidnapping and coercion brought by Mr. William Blackwood against Mr. Elias Kane concerning Miss Eleanor Murphy. Eleanor stepped forward before Elias could speak. Your Honor, I was not kidnapped. Mr. Kane offered me marriage to escape Mr. Blackwood's unlawful imprisonment of my person, and I accepted freely. Blackwood rose to his feet. She was distraught, not thinking clearly. This drifter took advantage. I was chained to a post in the middle of town. Eleanor interrupted, her voice rising with indignation. By your orders, because I wouldn't marry you, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wilson banged his gavel. Order, Your Honor, Blackwood's lawyer interjected smoothly. Miss Murphy is a woman alone, vulnerable since her father's passing. Mr. Blackwood, as a respected businessman, was simply trying to protect her reputation when she began behaving erratically at church. That's not true, Eleanor protested. Judge Wilson peered at her over his spectacles. Miss Murphy, are you claiming that Mr. Blackwood restrained you against your will? Yes, ask anyone who was in town yesterday. The judge looked out at the assembled townspeople. Would anyone care to corroborate Miss Murphy's account? A tense silence fell. Eleanor's heart sank as she watched familiar faces avoid her gaze. Even Martha, who had been so kind, studied her hands in her lap. Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke. I saw it. Heads turned to see Ida Jackson, the laundress slowly rising to her feet. At 60, Ida was one of the few people in town not directly dependent on Blackwood's mine. I saw Mr. Blackwood's men chain Miss Murphy to that post, Ida continued, her voice gaining strength. Heard him say she'd stay there until she learned gratitude for his proposal. Another voice joined in young Tom Peterson, who helped his father at the livery. I saw it too. My pa told me not to look, but I did. One by one, more voices added to the chorus until nearly a dozen people had spoken up. Blackwood's face grew increasingly red as his lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Judge Wilson cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Blackwood, these are serious allegations. They're exaggerating, Blackwood insisted. It was merely a symbolic restraint for her own safety. There was nothing symbolic about those iron shackles, Elias said coldly. I've arrested men for less during my time with the Rangers. The judge shifted uneasily. Well, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. In any case, Miss Murphy appears to be unharmed and making her own choices now. The charges against Mr. Kane are dismissed. Blackwood surged to his feet. This is outrageous. She belongs to herself, Elias cut in, stepping protectively closer to Eleanor. And soon she'll be my wife. The judge banged his gavel. This hearing is concluded. Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you accept that Miss Murphy has made her choice. As they left the courthouse, Eleanor could feel Blackwood's eyes burning into her back. Outside, she released a shaky breath. He won't give up so easily. I know, Elias replied grimly. We need to leave town immediately. They returned to the boarding house to collect their few belongings. Martha had packed them food for the journey and offered Eleanor a sturdy riding skirt that had belonged to her daughter. It's 3 days to Silver Springs if the weather holds, Martha told them as Elias secured their supplies to his saddle. Keep to the main trail until Miller's Creek, then take the South Fork. Eleanor thanked the older woman with a warm embrace. Your kindness won't be forgotten. Martha patted her cheek. Just be happy, child. That man who came to your rescue, he's got good eyes. Trust that. They left Copper Ridge with the morning sun climbing higher in the sky, Eleanor seated behind Elias on his buckskin, her arms wrapped around his waist. The town quickly fell away behind them as they followed the dusty trail east. By midday, they had put several miles between themselves and Copper Ridge. Elias pulled his horse to a stop beside a small stream shaded by cottonwoods. We should rest the horse and eat something, he said, helping Eleanor dismount. Her legs were stiff from the unaccustomed riding, and she stretched gratefully in the dappled shade. Elias spread his coat on the ground for her to sit on and handed her bread and jerky from their provisions. Do you think Blackwood will follow us? She asked as they ate. Elias's expression was thoughtful. Maybe not personally, but he might send men. A man like that doesn't take humiliation well. I never meant to humiliate him, Eleanor said softly. I just couldn't bear the thought of being his wife. He's cruel to those beneath him. I've seen how he treats his workers. You don't need to explain, Elias assured her. No woman should be forced into marriage against her will. A comfortable silence fell between them as they finished their meal. Eleanor watched Elias as he checked his horse's hooves and adjusted the saddle. There was something reassuring about his methodical movements, the quiet competence with which he approached each task. May I ask you something personal? She ventured when he returned to sit beside her. Of course. Why aren't you married already? You must be. She hesitated. 32, he supplied with a slight smile, and I was engaged once back in Texas. Catherine was a rancher's daughter. We grew up together. What happened? Eleanor asked gently, noting the shadow that crossed his face. She died. Influenza swept through the county 4 years ago. By the time I got back from a manhunt, she was already gone. His voice was steady, but Eleanor could hear the old pain beneath the words. I'm sorry, she said simply, resting her hand briefly on his arm. He nodded, accepting her sympathy. What about you? Before Blackwood, was there someone? Eleanor smiled faintly. James Collier. He was studying to be a doctor in Denver. We wrote letters for a year, but then he took a position in New York. Said a frontier town wasn't the place to build a medical practice. She shrugged. He wasn't wrong. His loss, Elias said, catching her gaze. Something warm fluttered in Eleanor's chest at the sincerity in his eyes. Before she could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats made them both tense. Elias was on his feet in an instant, hand on his gun. Get behind the trees, he instructed, his voice low and urgent. Eleanor obeyed, gathering their things quickly as Elias led his horse into the shelter of the cottonwoods. They waited, breath held, as 3 riders appeared on the trail they had just traveled. Blackwood's men, Eleanor whispered, recognizing the foreman, Dirk Harlow, and 2 others from the mine. Elias nodded grimly. They're tracking us. They watched in tense silence as the men stopped at the stream, dismounting to check the ground for signs of their passage. Dirk knelt, examining the fresh hoofprints near the water. They stopped here, he called to the others. Can't be more than an hour ahead. Blackwood wants the woman back alive, one of the men said. What about the ranger? Dirk spat on the ground. Blackwood says he doesn't care if he comes back feet first, long as it looks like an accident. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Elias's jaw tightened as he silently drew his revolver. Let's move, Dirk ordered. We can catch them before nightfall if we push hard. The men remounted and continued along the trail, unaware of how close their quarry was. Once they were out of sight, Elias turned to Eleanor. We need to change course, he said. They'll expect us to head straight for Silver Springs. Where will we go instead? North, into the mountains. I know some trails from my ranger days tracking smugglers. It's rougher country, but they won't expect it. Eleanor nodded, trusting his judgment. I can manage. They mounted up again, Elias taking them across the stream and into the rocky terrain that rose to their north. The going was slower on the less traveled paths, but by sundown, Eleanor felt confident they had successfully evaded their pursuers. They made camp in a sheltered hollow, Elias building only a small fire to minimize their visibility. The night grew cold as darkness fell, and Eleanor huddled closer to the flames, wrapping Martha's shawl tightly around her shoulders. Here, Elias said, settling his coat around her. The nights get cold in these hills. What about you? She protested. I've slept in worse conditions, he assured her with a small smile. Rangers don't get used to comfort. As they shared the remaining bread and some dried apples Martha had packed, Eleanor found herself studying Elias's profile in the firelight. The planes of his face were strong, his expression thoughtful as he gazed into the flames. Do you miss it? She asked, being a ranger. He considered her question carefully. I miss the purpose of it, knowing I was making a difference, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He prodded the fire with a stick. But the violence wears on a man. The last group we went after they'd killed a family, even the children. When we caught up to them, he shook his head. I found I didn't recognize myself afterward. That's when I knew it was time to leave. And now you're heading to your uncle's ranch in California. That's the plan. He breeds horses some of the finest in the West, according to his letters. Says he could use a partner with a strong back and a clear head. Elias looked up at her. It's good land, Eleanor, fertile valley, plenty of water, a place where a person could put down roots. The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. It sounds lovely, she said softly. It could be, he agreed, holding her gaze across the fire. For the right people. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Eleanor looked away, suddenly shy. We should rest. Tomorrow will be another long day. Elias nodded, banking the fire for the night. He spread his bedroll a respectful distance from hers, but close enough that he could reach her quickly if danger approached. "Good night, Eleanor," he said as they settled beneath the vast canopy of stars. "Good night, Elias," she replied, curling up beneath his coat, surrounded by his scent leather horse and something uniquely him. Despite the hard ground beneath her and the uncertainty ahead, Eleanor fell asleep faster than she had in months, lulled by the steady sound of Elias's breathing nearby and the strange new feeling of security his presence provided. Morning came with a fine mist clinging to the hills around them. They ate a quick breakfast of jerky and the last of the bread, then continued their journey northward. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, with Elias occasionally dismounting to lead the horse through particularly difficult passages. By midday, they had climbed high enough to look back over the vast expanse of territory they'd covered. In the distance, Eleanor could make out the faint smudge of smoke that marked Copper Ridge. "Will you miss it?" Elias asked, following her gaze. "Parts of it," she admitted. "The store my father built, Mrs. Leary who taught me to sew, the Christmas socials at the church," she sighed. "But mostly, I'll miss who I was there, the daughter of a respected merchant with a place in the community." "You can build a new place," Elias said gently. "Somewhere you're valued for yourself, not for who your father was or who wants to possess you." Eleanor turned to him, struck by the understanding in his words. "Is that what you're doing, building a new place for yourself?" "Trying to," he acknowledged with a small smile. "Though I didn't expect to be doing it with a wife." The word sent an unexpected thrill through Eleanor. Wife. She would be someone's wife, even if only temporarily. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the trail gradually descending toward a narrow valley. As the sun began to set, Elias pointed to a small cabin nestled against the hillside ahead. "Ranger Way Station," he explained. "Used it a few times tracking smugglers across the territory. Should be abandoned now, but it'll give us better shelter than another night under the stars." The cabin was indeed empty, a simple one-room structure with a stone fireplace and rough wooden furnishings. Dust covered every surface, but the roof was sound and the chimney clear. While Elias tended to his horse in the small lean-to attached to the cabin, Eleanor swept the floor with a makeshift broom of bundled twigs and shook out the single, thin mattress on the narrow bed frame. By the time Elias returned, she had a small fire going in the hearth and was heating water in a dented pot she'd found. "You've worked miracles," he said, looking around the now habitable space. Eleanor smiled, pleased by his approval. "It's hardly that. But it will be more comfortable than the ground." As darkness fell, they shared the last of their provisions, dried beef and the remaining apples. The fire cast a warm glow throughout the cabin, creating a sense of intimacy that hadn't existed during their night under the stars. "We'll reach Silver Springs day after tomorrow if we maintain our pace," Elias said as they finished eating. "Judge Morrison can marry us legally and then—" He hesitated. "And then," Eleanor prompted softly. Elias met her eyes across the small table. "And then we have choices. We can continue to California together and see if this arrangement might become something real, or I can see you safely to Denver or another city where you can make a fresh start." Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. 2 days ago, he had been a complete stranger. Now he was to be her husband. The speed of events should have terrified her, yet somehow she felt calmer and more certain than she had in months. "Why did you really help me, Elias?" she asked. "The truth." He was silent for a long moment, his green eyes reflecting the firelight. "When I saw you chained to that post, something in me just broke. I've seen too many people hurt by those with power, too many lives crushed beneath boots like Blackwood's." He ran a hand through his hair, but it was more than that. "There was something in your eyes, defiance, courage, even as exhausted as you were. I admired that immediately." "And now," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "what do you feel now?" Elias reached across the table, his calloused fingers gently covering hers. "Now I find myself hoping you'll choose to come to California, not out of necessity or gratitude, but because you might want to see if there could be something real between us." Eleanor turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I think I'd like that," she admitted, to see what might grow between us. His smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines earned from years facing the worst humanity had to offer. Eleanor found herself smiling in return, a fragile hope blooming in her heart. The question of sleeping arrangements presented itself as the fire burned lower. There was only the one narrow bed, barely large enough for two. "I'll take the floor," Elias said immediately, already gathering his coat to make a pallet. "You don't have to," Eleanor said, then blushed at his raised eyebrow. "I mean, the bed is small, but we could share it, just to sleep," she added hastily. "It seems foolish for you to be uncomfortable when we're to be married in 2 days." Elias studied her face carefully. "Are you certain?" She nodded, though her cheeks remained pink. "Yes." They settled awkwardly on the narrow mattress, lying back to back with a careful space between them. Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from him, the sound of his breathing, the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly into the darkness. "Good night, Elias," she replied, certain she would never fall asleep with him so close. Yet somehow, lulled by his steady presence and exhausted from their journey, she did. Eleanor woke to warm sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window. She was alone in the bed, but could hear Elias moving about outside. For a moment, she simply lay there, cataloging the unfamiliar sensations: the rough blanket against her skin, the smell of wood smoke and pine, the distant call of birds she couldn't name. This was her life now, uncertain, unplanned, yet somehow more alive than the careful existence she'd maintained in Copper Ridge after her father's death. The realization brought both anxiety and exhilaration. She rose and quickly washed her face in the basin of water Elias had left for her. After arranging her hair as best she could without proper pins, she stepped outside to find him checking his horse's shoes. "Good morning," he called, straightening when he saw her. "I found some coffee in the supplies. It's old but drinkable." "That sounds wonderful," she replied, smiling at the thoughtful gesture. They shared a simple breakfast of coffee and the last of their provisions. As they prepared to depart, Eleanor took one last look at the cabin that had sheltered them. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Elias smiled, understanding in his eyes. "We should reach Miller's Creek by nightfall. There's a trading post there where we can resupply." The day's journey took them through breathtaking country pine forests, giving way to open meadows filled with wildflowers, streams cutting through rocky terrain. Eleanor found herself chatting more freely with Elias as they rode, sharing stories of her childhood in Copper Ridge and listening to his tales of ranger exploits. "What about your family?" she asked as they stopped to rest in the shade of a towering pine. "Besides your uncle in California, I mean." "My parents died in a flood when I was 16, he replied. "My younger sister, Emma, married a shopkeeper in Austin. They have 3 children now." A fond smile crossed his face. "The youngest is named after me. You must miss them." "I do," he acknowledged. "I write when I can, visit when work permits." He glanced at her. "Perhaps we could stop in Austin on our way to California if you'd like to meet them." The casual inclusion of her in his future plans warmed Eleanor unexpectedly. "I'd like that very much." As promised, they reached Miller's Creek by early evening. The trading post was a sturdy log structure serving the scattered homesteads and mining claims in the area. A few horses were hitched outside, including 3 that made Elias tense as they approached. "Those are Blackwood's men's horses," he said quietly, helping Eleanor dismount a safe distance away. "Stay here while I assess the situation. Be careful," she whispered, fear clutching at her heart. Elias nodded, moving cautiously toward the trading post. Through the dusty window, he could see Dirk Harlow and his companions inside, talking with the proprietor. He returned quickly to Eleanor. "They're showing your description to the trader," he reported grimly. "We need to find another way around." They retreated into the trees, leading the horse quietly until they were safely out of sight of the trading post. Elias studied the terrain thoughtfully. "There's an old trapper's trail that skirts Miller's Creek to the north," he said. "It's rougher going, but it will keep us clear of the main road where they're likely watching." "I can manage rough," Eleanor assured him, squaring her shoulders. Elias smiled at her determination. "I believe you can." They made camp that night in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines, building only the smallest of fires to avoid detection. Their supplies were running low, but Elias managed to catch 2 rabbits, which Eleanor surprised him by efficiently skinning and preparing for cooking. "My father taught me," she explained, seeing his raised eyebrows. "He said a woman on the frontier should know how to fend for herself." "A wise man," Elias commented, impressed. As they ate, Eleanor found herself watching the play of firelight across Elias's features. In just a few days, he had become the center of her world, her protector, her companion, and soon her husband. The thought sent a pleasant shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "Cold?" he asked, noticing her reaction. "No," she admitted softly. "Just thinking about tomorrow, about becoming your wife." His expression grew serious. "Are you having doubts?" "Not doubts exactly, more wonderings." She met his gaze across the fire. "When you marry me tomorrow, what will you expect?" Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Eleanor, I would never pressure you. Marriage on paper is enough to keep you safe from Blackwood. Anything more." He hesitated. "That should come in its own time if and when you're ready." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly. "For being honorable." "Don't thank me for basic decency," he replied with a wry smile. "Besides, I'm hoping to earn your trust, and perhaps eventually your affection." The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. "You're well on your way to both," she admitted. The night passed peacefully, though Elias insisted on taking turns keeping watch in case Blackwood's men had somehow tracked them. By dawn, they were on the move again, following the faint trapper's trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. By mid-afternoon, the spire of Silver Springs Church came into view in the valley below. Eleanor felt her heart quicken at the sight. By sunset, she would be a married woman. "We made it," she said with relief as they began their descent into the town. "Not quite home free yet," Elias cautioned. "But close." Silver Springs was larger than Copper Ridge, a proper town with wooden sidewalks lining the main street and a 2-story hotel boasting real glass windows. As they rode in, Eleanor was conscious of her travel-worn appearance and disheveled hair, suddenly self-conscious at the thought of appearing before a judge to be married. Elias seemed to sense her discomfort. "Let's get rooms at the hotel first," he suggested. "You can rest and refresh yourself while I locate Judge Morrison." The hotel clerk barely raised an eyebrow at their dusty appearance, though his gaze lingered curiously on Eleanor's fine dress, now showing the wear of 3 days' hard travel. Elias requested adjoining rooms and paid in advance with silver dollars that caught the afternoon light. In her room, Eleanor gratefully used the pitcher and basin to wash away the trail dust. Her reflection in the small mirror revealed a woman she hardly recognized, sun-kissed cheeks, wind-tangled hair, eyes bright with a new determination. She did her best to mend her appearance, wishing for a fresh dress for her wedding day. A soft knock at her door announced Elias's return. When she opened it, she found him similarly refreshed, his hair damp from washing, his face cleanly shaved. "Judge Morrison can see us at 5 o'clock, he reported. "That gives us an hour." Eleanor nodded, suddenly nervous. "I wish I had something more suitable to wear." Elias studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I bought something while I was out," he said, offering it to her. "It's not much, but I thought you should have it." Inside the pouch, Eleanor found a simple gold band. Her breath caught as she looked up at him. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Every bride should have a ring," he said simply, "even if the circumstances are unusual." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you." They walked to the courthouse together, Eleanor's hand resting lightly in the crook of Elias's arm. The late afternoon sun bathed the town in golden light as they climbed the wooden steps to the imposing brick building. Judge Morrison was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He greeted them in his office, looking up from a stack of papers. "Mr. Kane, Miss Murphy," he acknowledged. "I understand you wish to be married today." "Yes, Your Honor," Elias confirmed. The judge studied them thoughtfully. "Forgive my directness, but I've been on the bench long enough to recognize when a couple is in some kind of trouble. Are you being pursued?" Eleanor exchanged a glance with Elias, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to speak the truth. William Blackwood of Copper Ridge, she explained. He wanted me to marry him. When I refused, he had me chained to a post in the town center. Mr. Kane intervened and offered me his protection through marriage. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. I've heard of Blackwood. Man has a reputation for getting what he wants. He looked between them. And this marriage, it's what you both desire, not merely a convenient solution to your troubles. It began that way, Elias admitted. But I've come to care for Miss Murphy and would be honored to have her as my wife for however long she'll have me. Eleanor's heart warmed at his words. And I have developed genuine regard for Mr. Kane, she added softly. I believe we could build a good life together. The judge nodded, seemingly satisfied. Very well, do you have witnesses? No, Your Honor, Elias replied. We don't know anyone in town. That won't do, Morrison said, rising from his desk. A marriage needs witnesses. Mrs. Porter, he called. His clerk, a matronly woman in her 50s, appeared promptly. Yes, Judge, find Mr. Davis from the land office. We need a second witness for a wedding. Within minutes, the judge's office held their small wedding party. Judge Morrison took his position behind his desk, opening a well-worn Bible. Join hands, he instructed. Eleanor placed her trembling hand in Elias's steady one, drawing strength from his reassuring grip. As Judge Morrison began the ceremony, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, connected by their clasped hands and the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Do you, Elias Kane, take Eleanor Murphy to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Elias's green eyes held her steadily. I do. And do you, Eleanor Murphy, take Elias Kane to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over her. 4 days ago, this man had been a stranger. Now he was to be her husband, perhaps temporarily, perhaps forever. Either way, she was choosing this path freely. I do, she said clearly. The ring, Judge Morrison prompted. Elias withdrew the simple gold band from his pocket and slipped it onto Eleanor's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife, the judge declared. You may kiss your bride. Elias hesitated, his eyes questioning. Eleanor gave a small nod and he leaned forward, pressing his lips gently to hers in a kiss that was brief but tender. It was Eleanor's first kiss as a married woman, and despite the unusual circumstances, she found herself wishing it had lasted longer. After signing the marriage certificate and thanking their witnesses, they stepped out into the fading light of evening as husband and wife. For a moment, they stood in silence on the courthouse steps, the enormity of what they had done settling over them. Mrs. Kane, Elias said softly, testing the name. Eleanor smiled, surprising herself with how right it sounded. Mr. Kane, he offered his arm. Shall we have a wedding supper at the hotel dining room? I believe the occasion calls for something more substantial than trail rations. I would like that very much, she agreed, taking his arm. The hotel dining room was modestly elegant, with white tablecloths and actual silverware. A few other diners glanced curiously at them as they were seated at a corner table. Elias ordered steak for both of them, along with potatoes and greens and a bottle of wine to celebrate. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass to hers. New beginnings, she echoed, sipping the sweet red wine. As they ate, a tension Eleanor hadn't fully acknowledged began to build between them. They were married now, legally bound. Tonight there would be no separate bedrolls, no cabin floor for Elias to sleep on. The thought sent heat rising to her cheeks. Elias seemed to sense her thoughts. Eleanor, he said quietly, nothing needs to happen tonight that you're not ready for. Marriage on paper is enough to keep you safe from Blackwood. She met his gaze across the table, touched by his consideration. And if I were ready, she asked softly, what then? Something darkened in his eyes. Then I would consider myself the luckiest man in the Arizona territory. The simple honesty of his answer sent a pleasant shiver through her. In the span of 4 days, this man had risked his life for her, shown her nothing but respect and kindness, and now offered her both protection and freedom. The attraction she felt toward him was undeniable, growing stronger with each passing day. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we could see where the evening leads us." Their meal concluded with a shared slice of apple pie, the sweetness a luxury after days of travel rations. As they walked back to their rooms, Eleanor's pulse quickened with anticipation and nervousness in equal measure. At her door, Elias paused. "I meant what I said, Eleanor. There's no expectation." She reached up, her fingers lightly touching his freshly shaven cheek. "I know, that's one of the reasons I trust you." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Elias lowered his head and kissed her. Unlike the brief, chaste kiss at their wedding, this one lingered, deepening as Eleanor responded, her hands moving to his shoulders. When they finally parted, both were breathing faster. Elias rested his forehead against hers, his hands gently holding her waist. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Eleanor opened her door and led him inside into their first night as husband and wife. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting a golden glow across the hotel room. Eleanor woke slowly, acutely aware of the warm presence beside her. Elias slept peacefully, one arm draped protectively across her waist even in slumber. She studied his face in repose, softer without the watchfulness that normally characterized his expression. Last night had been a revelation, gentle and passionate by turns, as they discovered each other as husband and wife. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into something else entirely, something with the potential to become deep and lasting. Elias stirred, his green eyes opening to find her watching him. A slow smile spread across his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Kane," he said, his voice husky with sleep. "Good morning, husband," she replied, savoring the word. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender fingers. "Any regrets about yesterday?" Eleanor shook her head. "None. You? Only that I didn't meet you sooner," he answered, drawing her closer for a kiss that quickly rekindled the passion of the night before. Later, as they dressed for the day, Elias broached the subject of their next steps. "We should leave town today. Blackwood's men could still be searching for us." Eleanor nodded, securing her hair with the few remaining pins. "Where to now? California, eventually," Elias agreed. "But I was thinking we might take a more roundabout route. Visit my sister in Austin first, then perhaps head up through Colorado before turning west." "A proper honeymoon journey," Eleanor suggested with a smile. Elias crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Eleanor, I want you to know something. What began as a rescue has become much more to me. I find myself falling in love with you, your courage, your kindness, your strength. I don't expect you to feel the same way yet, but I hope," she silenced him with a finger to his lips. "Elias Kane, I believe I started falling in love with you the moment you offered me water when no one else would. It may have happened quickly, but some things in life simply feel right." She smiled up at him. "This feels right." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough before he pulled her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of such moments to come. They departed Silver Springs mid-morning, Elias having purchased supplies sufficient for several days' travel. As they rode out of town, Eleanor sitting behind him with her arms around his waist, she felt a sense of freedom and possibility she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked as they crested a hill, the town falling away behind them. "That sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best," she replied, resting her cheek against his back. "If Blackwood hadn't chained me to that post, you never would have stopped." "I like to think we would have found each other somehow," Elias said. "Some people are meant to meet." The romantic sentiment surprised and delighted her. Elias Kane, beneath that tough ranger exterior, beats the heart of a poet. His laughter rumbled against her cheek. "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain." They traveled steadily for the next 3 days, avoiding main roads and keeping a watchful eye for any sign of pursuit. By the 4th day after their wedding, they were confident they had successfully evaded Blackwood's men. That evening they made camp beside a small lake, the water reflecting the sunset in brilliant oranges and purples. After a supper of fresh, caught fish, they sat side by side against a fallen log, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Eleanor's head rested on Elias's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "When we reach California, we'll need a place of our own." "Your uncle's ranch," Eleanor began, "is a good place to start," Elias agreed. "But I want to build something that's ours. A home where we can raise a family if you want that." The mention of a family sent a warm flush through Eleanor. "I do want that," she admitted. "Very much. I have some savings from my ranger days," he continued. "Enough for a modest piece of land, maybe along the coast. I hear it's beautiful there, the ocean stretching as far as you can see." Eleanor tried to imagine it, having never seen the ocean herself. "It sounds wonderful." "It will be," he promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Our new beginning." As they settled into their bedroll that night, the stars wheeling overhead and the future stretching before them full of promise, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. From the despair of being chained to a post in Copper Ridge to the joy of being in her husband's arms, all in the span of a week. "I love you, Elias Kane," she whispered as sleep began to claim her, his arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Eleanor Kane. Rest now. Tomorrow is another day of our adventure together." Secure in his embrace and in their shared future, Eleanor drifted into peaceful slumber, leaving behind the shadows of her past for the brightness of what lay ahead. 14 months later, Eleanor stood on the porch of their newly completed home, gazing out at the Pacific Ocean gleaming in the distance. The ranch house wasn't large, but it was solidly built with Douglas fir and stone, positioned on a gentle slope that offered views of both the sea and the rolling pastures where Elias's horses grazed. The journey from Arizona to California had taken longer than expected, with a 2-month stay in Austin where Eleanor had been warmly welcomed by Elias's sister and her family. Emma Kane Thornton had embraced her new sister-in-law without reservation, the two women forming a friendship that continued through regular correspondence. From Texas, they had traveled north through Colorado, avoiding the southern routes where Blackwood's influence might still reach. The detour had proven fortunate when they encountered a horse trader with a small herd of exceptional mares that Elias recognized as valuable breeding stock. The purchase had consumed most of their savings, but upon reaching California, Elias's uncle had been so impressed with the horses' quality that he'd offered them a partnership and a portion of his land to establish their own breeding operation. The past year had been one of hard work and great joy as they built their home and their business together. Eleanor had discovered a talent for keeping the ranch's accounts and corresponding with potential buyers, while Elias's reputation as a former ranger lent credibility to their fledgling enterprise. Daydreaming again. Elias's voice interrupted her thoughts as he came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her expanding waistline. At 6 months pregnant, Eleanor carried the visible evidence of their love and future. "Just counting our blessings," she replied, leaning back against his solid chest. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't ridden into Copper Ridge that day?" "Sometimes," he admitted, his hands gentle on her belly where their child grew. "But then I think it was never really chance. I was always meant to find you." Eleanor turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "My rescuer, my heart," he countered, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew them apart. A rider was coming up the road toward their ranch, the late afternoon sun at his back making it difficult to identify him. "Are we expecting anyone?" Eleanor asked, suddenly uneasy. Old fears died hard, and part of her still looked over her shoulder for Blackwood's men, even after all this time. "No," Elias said, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver he still wore when working the ranch. "Stay here." He stepped off the porch, moving to intercept the rider before he reached the house. Eleanor watched anxiously as the stranger dismounted and the two men spoke. To her surprise, after a moment, Elias's posture relaxed and he gestured toward the house. As they approached, Eleanor recognized the visitor with a shock. Sheriff Jenkins from Copper Ridge, older and more weathered than she remembered, but unmistakable. "Mrs. Kane, he greeted her, removing his hat. You're looking well. Very well, he added with a nod to her pregnant state. Sheriff Jenkins, she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. This is unexpected. I'm not sheriff anymore, he corrected. Resigned my post 6 months ago. Been traveling since then, making my way west. He glanced at Elias. Your husband was kind enough to invite me to stay for supper, if that's agreeable to you. Eleanor looked to Elias, who nodded reassuringly. Of course, she said. Please come inside. Over a meal of venison stew and fresh bread, Jenkins shared news of Copper Ridge. Town's changed since you left, he told them. Blackwood's mine played out about a year ago. Silver vein just dried up without warning. What happened to Blackwood? Elias asked, the question Eleanor couldn't bring herself to voice. Jenkins smiled grimly. Lost everything trying to find another vein, borrowed heavily mortgaged properties all over the territory. When it became clear there was no more silver to be had, his creditors came calling. He took a sip of coffee. Last I heard, he was working as a clerk in a mercantile in Tucson, quite a fall for a man who once owned a town. Eleanor felt no joy at Blackwood's downfall, only a profound relief that he no longer posed any threat to her happiness. And the townspeople. Some moved on when the mine closed. Others stayed, found new ways to make a living. Copper Ridge is smaller now, but maybe healthier for it. Jenkins looked between them. Word got around about what Blackwood did to you, Mrs. Kane. After you left, people started speaking up about other things he'd done. Man had a lot to answer for. After supper, Jenkins accepted their offer to stay in the small guest room. Once their visitor was settled, Eleanor and Elias retired to their bedroom, the unexpected news from their past creating a thoughtful mood. Are you all right? Elias asked as Eleanor brushed her hair at the dressing table, her movements slower than usual. Yes, she said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. It's strange to hear about Copper Ridge. For so long, it was all I knew, and then suddenly it wasn't part of my life anymore. Elias moved behind her, taking the brush from her hands to continue the soothing strokes through her auburn hair. Do you ever regret leaving? Never, she said firmly, reaching back to catch his hand. Everything I need is here. He helped her to bed, arranging pillows to support her back as she'd found most comfortable in recent months. As they lay together in the darkness, Elias's hand resting protectively over their unborn child, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. I was thinking, she said softly, if it's a boy, we could name him Thomas, after my father. Thomas Kane, Elias tested the name. It has a strong sound to it. And if it's a girl, Eleanor continued, perhaps Catherine, after your first love. She was important to you, and I would like to honor her memory. Elias was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Eleanor Kane, you continue to amaze me with the generosity of your heart. Is that a yes? She asked, smiling in the darkness. It's a yes, he confirmed, drawing her closer. Thomas or Catherine Kane will be very lucky to have you as their mother. And you as their father, she added, settling comfortably against him. A former Texas Ranger who rescues damsels in distress and builds them homes by the sea. Only one damsel, he corrected, pressing a kiss to her hair. The only one who matters. 3 weeks later, Jenkins departed for San Francisco with their good wishes and letters of introduction to several horse buyers Elias knew in the city. His visit had brought unexpected closure to that chapter of their lives, allowing them to focus fully on the future they were building together. Spring arrived with gentle rains that turned the coastal hills a vibrant green. Eleanor's time grew near, transforming her from merely pregnant to abundantly so, her movements becoming increasingly careful as she navigated their home. Elias hovered anxiously, hiring a young woman from the nearby town to help with household tasks and sending for the midwife weeks before she was actually needed. His protectiveness might have been stifling had it not been so endearing. This strong man, who had faced down outlaws and survived wilderness hardships, reduced to nervous pacing at the prospect of impending fatherhood. You've faced a dozen armed men without flinching, Eleanor teased one evening as she watched him check the contents of the birthing kit for the 3rd time that week. Yet the thought of one tiny baby has you in knots. Those men only threatened my life, he replied with a wry smile. This baby holds my heart. The words were spoken lightly, but Eleanor recognized the depth of feeling behind them. Elias had lost so many people. He loved his parents, his first fiancé, comrades during his ranger days. The prospect of new life brought both joy and fear. "Come here," she said softly, patting the sofa beside her. When he joined her, she took his hand and placed it where the baby was kicking vigorously. "Feel that. That's our child saying hello to their father. Strong and stubborn already must take after you." Elias laughed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Poor child, if they've inherited my stubbornness and your determination, they'll be unstoppable." "Exactly as they should be," Eleanor agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. The baby arrived on a clear April morning, entering the world with a lusty cry after 12 hours of labor that tested Eleanor's endurance and Elias's composure. When the midwife placed the squalling infant in Eleanor's arms, tears of joy streamed down her face. "You have a daughter," the midwife announced, smiling at the new parents. "Catherine," Eleanor whispered, gazing down at the tiny red face framed by wisps of dark hair. "Catherine Kane." Elias, who had remained steadfastly by her side throughout the ordeal, reached out with trembling fingers to touch his daughter's cheek. "She's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "just like her mother." The first weeks of Catherine's life passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and precious moments of discovery. She had Elias's green eyes and the promise of Eleanor's auburn hair, a perfect blend of them both. Elias proved to be a natural father, as comfortable cradling his tiny daughter as he was breaking wild horses. By summer, they had settled into a new rhythm as a family of 3. The horse breeding business flourished, with their first foals attracting buyers from as far away as Oregon and Nevada. Eleanor managed to keep the accounts and correspondence while caring for Catherine, often working with the baby sleeping contentedly in a basket beside her desk. On warm evenings, they would walk together to the bluff overlooking the ocean, Elias carrying Catherine as Eleanor collected wildflowers along the path. It was during one such evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, that Elias broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "I received a letter from Emma yesterday," he said as they settled on their favorite bench. "She's asked if we might visit for Christmas. She's eager to meet her niece." Eleanor smiled, picturing the joyful reunion. "I'd like that. Catherine should know her aunt and cousins." Elias nodded, his expression thoughtful as he gazed out at the ocean. "The letter got me thinking about journeys, the ones we've already taken and the ones that lie ahead." "What kind of journeys are you contemplating now?" Eleanor asked, curious about the philosophical turn of his thoughts. He turned to face her, shifting Catherine to rest against his shoulder. "When I rescued you from that post in Copper Ridge, I was a man with no real destination, just moving westward because it seemed like the right direction at the time." Eleanor reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar line of his jaw. "And now I know exactly where I belong," he said simply. "Wherever you and Catherine are, that's my true north, my destination, my home." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "When I was chained to that post," she said softly, "I prayed for deliverance, for someone to help me. But I never imagined that my rescuer would also be my greatest love, the father of my child, the man who would show me what it means to be truly free." Elias leaned forward, careful of the baby between them, and kissed her with a tenderness that still had the power to make her heart race. "I love you, Eleanor Kane, more today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow. And I love you," she whispered against his lips. "My cowboy, my husband, my heart." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the small family made their way back to the house that love had built. The path ahead would have its challenges, seasons of drought and plenty, joys and sorrows yet unimagined, but they would face them together, bound by a love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances and grown into something rare and precious. For Eleanor, who had once been chained to a post for refusing a rich suitor, and Elias, who had claimed her as his bride in a moment of righteous intervention, Their story was proof that sometimes the darkest moments could lead to the brightest futures. Their love, born of courage and compassion, would continue to light their way forward, a beacon guiding them home to each other always.